They asked me to come down and share with you the journey that my family and I have been on the past 20 plus years as we've moved down the path of regenerative agriculture. And it's been a long, slow process for me. I envy the young producers that are getting into this now because they're able to do it at warp speed, so to speak. One thing I want to make perfectly clear is that I am in no way here today to tell you how you should or shouldn't run your operation. That's up for you to decide. All I'm doing is sharing my experiences. However, I'm very confident that the principles I'm going to share with you today will work anywhere in the world where there's production agriculture and on any size operation in the world. So I know the operation I run's a bit larger than most of those in North Carolina. Just don't even pay attention to that. It has nothing to do with scale. It has everything to do with focusing on the resource in a holistic type manner. So this is what North Dakota looks like during the summer, a little bit different than North Carolina here. Here's another picture of our ranch at sunset. Our ranch is located right in the city of Bismarck's jurisdiction. City of Bismarck is approximately 75,000 people. There's about 100,000 people within 10, 15 miles of our operation. Realize that North Dakota only has approximately 650,000 or so people in the entire state. So a little bit different than you're used to out here. Now, most of the people, when they hear the word North Dakota, they think, boy, that's pretty cold up there. And we are a little bit. This is total days below freezing, with 223 days on average. We have about 120 frost-free days between last frost and first frost, you know? So that's our growing season, so a bit different than here. Now, how cold does it get in North Dakota? You know, it was a little cool this morning, and I'm sure some of you on farms, if you pull into the farmyard on a cool morning and that vehicle is warm, your cat's gonna jump up on the hood of that car, right? Well, this is what happens in North Dakota. You know, we tend to get a little colder, so anything tends to take advantage of that. Now, usually when people hear the word North Dakota, they think we're up on the tundra with muskox. This actually is not a herd of muskox. This is 300 plus of our cow-calf pairs grazing cover crops at 40 degrees below zero. And they're just fine out there. You know, I got to tell you, be honest with you, I felt a little sorry for my son as I sat in the pickup and made him walk out there and take this picture, but I made sure that he made it back. That's what our livestock do during the winter. You know, we don't treat them like a bed and breakfast. They are there to advance the resource for us and to convert cover crops into dollars. So they're acclimated to do that. So what do you have in common with me, somebody in this type of an environment? The thing we all have in common is soil. That's how come I'm so confident no matter where I go in the world and teach these principles, they'll work. Because we all have that common denominator of soil. So that's what I'm going to talk with you about today is how do we focus on our resources in creating a healthy ecosystem where we can advance soil health, thus advance our profits and advance human health as we put more nutrient-dense food on people's tables. Now, I put this presentation together knowing there was going to be a wide array of people in this audience today. So please, at any time, if you have questions, just raise your hand and ask. I'll repeat the question, and I'd rather answer your question while we're at that point in the presentation. It'll make it more enjoyable for everybody. So what I'm going to do is give you a history of our operation and then how we've gone down this path of learning how to use the 5 principles of building a healthy soil and what we've done with it. Then later this afternoon, I'm going to get into our stacked enterprise model and discuss with you all the different enterprises that we do on our operation to convert these resources into dollars. So a little bit about the history of our operation. The operation that I'm on was founded by my in-laws back in 1956. And they farmed it from 1956 to 1991 when my wife and I purchased a part of it from them. The cropping system consists of about 2,000 cropland acres. Now, my in-laws farmed it heavy tillage. It was half summer fallow, half crop. Intense tillage then, you know, multiple passes. They primarily just grew spring wheat, oats, and barley, all cool season small grains. And they did it with synthetics, fertilizers, pesticides, some fungicides, repeatedly every year. I was fortunate when my wife and I purchased it from them in 1991. We did some baseline soils work. And what we found was that organic matter levels were only 1.7 to 1.9% on the cropland. Now, historically speaking, soil scientists will tell you that in the northern plains there, organic matter levels should have been in the 7 to 8% range. So in other words, we had lost over 75% of the organic matter due to the way it was farmed, due to those farming practices. Now, NRCS came out in 1991 and they did some baseline infiltration work. And they found on those cropland acres, we could only infiltrate a half of an inch of rainfall per hour. Now, we only get 10 to 11 inches of rain per year. Then we get approximately another 4 to 5 inches of water from the 70, or in this year's case, 90 plus inches of snow we get. It's very dry snow. So we're working on about 15 to 16 inches of total precip. Well, if I can only infiltrate half of an inch per hour, and a lot of our rainfall comes in May, June as heavy thunderstorms, that means we're going to lose most of it. It's going to run off the soil, not infiltrate, taking with it soil particles and any nutrients. So that's critical to know. Now, besides the 2,000 acres of cropland, we have about 2,000 acres of true native prairie. What I mean by that is, to our knowledge, that has never ever been tilled. You know, it has never been tilled as far back as we can trace it. So those 2,000 acres are where the majority of our cow herd and some of the yearlings graze during the growing season, and some in the winter also. We also have another 1,000 acres of land that was at one time cropland and now has been seeded back to perennials. And you'll hear me refer to this as tame season pastures, because we've seeded it back to more introduced species, so to speak. Now, my in-laws used to run about 65 cow-calf pairs and 20 to 25 yearlings. That's all they could run on this operation, because it was set stocked. You know, the pastures had been overgrazed. They were put out in the pasture in the spring and left there till fall. That's just how it was. Brought into the corral land and fed hay for approximately 6 months out of the year. That's just the way it was for many, many years. So when my wife and I bought it from them, we farmed what, quote unquote, conventionally. I really don't like that, and I'll explain that more further in the presentation. But what people refer to as conventionally, that's how we farmed it for a few years. Primarily small grains with tillage. Then in 1994, I had a good friend in the northern part of North Dakota who was venturing into no-till. And he said, Gabe, you need to go no-till in order to save time and moisture. But he said, I'm going to give you some advice. If you're going to do that, sell all your tillage equipment. Then you'll never be tempted to go back. And I actually had to do that. As a young producer starting out, I couldn't afford this no-till drill unless I sold all the tillage equipment. So we did. So we've been 100% zero-till since 1994. So nothing ever gets tilled on our operation. Also in 1994, I started to diversify the crop rotation a little bit. I added peas to the rotation. And I did this simply to take advantage of nature. Above every acre, there's approximately 32,000 tons of atmospheric nitrogen. So why don't we take advantage of that? All we have to do is grow legumes, and we can take advantage of that. For all the years my father-in-law farmed, and the few years I've farmed conventionally, we didn't have any legumes in the rotation. Why wouldn't we do that? Why do we want to write a check for something when it's available to us free? And I don't see these principles are going to apply to grain farmers, but they're also going to apply in your garden. Because gardeners should be taking advantage of these principles also. Okay? Now, 1995 came along. We were diversifying the rotation a little bit, adding some other crops. And it wasn't just spring wheat. We had oats and barley and peas and a few other crops. I had 1,200 acres of spring wheat in, and the day before I was going to start combining, we got wiped out by hail. And I don't know if you get hail much down here, but we tend to get a lot of it in the northern plains. And this was pretty devastating for a young family starting out. We did not have any crop insurance at that time because hail, it just never occurred at such frequency that it would devastate your whole production, you know, because the farm is large enough and spread out. Usually you don't get it taking all your crop, but it did me that year. We lost 1,200 acres. Well, it was so devastating we didn't even have grazing for the livestock. So I had to figure out, okay, I got to quick seed something, this occurred in August, that I can get some grazing in the fall. So I did some studying and I came across winter triticale and hairy vetch. They're both fall-seeded biennials. You seed them in the fall, they start to grow, you can get a little grazing out of them, but then they come the next spring. And the reason I started down that path was to take advantage of another synergy in nature, and that's the interaction through mycorrhizal fungi that plants have. Because what really happens, hairy vetch being a legume, it'll fix nitrogen, and then it'll transfer that nitrogen through mycorrhizal fungi to the triticale plant, which is a grass plant, thus improving the growth of the triticale. The triticale, in turn, will uptake phosphorus, and through mycorrhizal fungi, it'll pass that on to the legume, the hairy vetch. So I'm taking advantage, I started taking advantage of these synergies in nature. 1996, I expanded the rotation a little more. I put corn into the rotation. Unfortunately, we lost 100% of our crop to hail again. So I'm like, okay, this is getting pretty devastating. We need to start really cutting expenses because I was going 2 years without paying the bank back. They don't like that. Well, 1997 came along, and 1997 was a drought in North Dakota. Nobody in our area combined an acre. So I was now 3 years of no income off the grain. So my wife and I both took off-farm jobs, and we had to learn to really cut costs. So I had to learn, how am I going to get this soil to function without borrowing money? Because the bank isn't going to loan me any more money. Now, the good thing was my in-laws had a contract for deed on the land, so I was pretty certain they weren't going to foreclose on me, you know. They had no desire to get back into farming, but it was a tough time. 1998 came along, and this is an actual photo off our ranch in 1998, and you can guess about what that brought. We lost 80% of our crop to hail again. So by that time, things were really starting to look pretty tough. You know, the piggy bank was really starting to look rough. I was really starting to question my career choice, and my wife was really starting to question her choice of husbands, you know. But the ironic thing is, amongst all the neighbors there was one other neighbor who got hit with 3 of those years, and there were several that had disasters 2 years. But we were the only operation that had devastation for 4 years running. And I tell people, those 4 years, although they were hell to go through, were absolutely the best thing that could ever happen to us. Because I never would have started down this journey of soil health. Laura would have never called me had it not been for these 4 years. Because it changed the way I looked at production agriculture. Now, after the fourth disaster there, the third hail event, I had to plant something. That one occurred in late June. I needed to plant something to feed my cattle. So I started planting sorghum sudan grass and cowpeas. Again, a legume and a grass to take advantage of the free nitrogen in the atmosphere and then to transfer it and work in synergy with the multi-species. Now, we planted this cowpea and sudan grass, and at that time, I didn't think of anything as a cover crop. I was just trying to stay alive, you know, and keep my livestock fed. We could not put this up for forage because I simply did not have the money to buy the twine for the baler. So we started to graze our livestock on it into late fall and winter. So this was our first real foray into extending the grazing season also. So we started grazing these crops as far as we could into winter. Now, what I really started to notice, though, was that our organic matter levels, I mentioned on the cropland, they were 1.7 to 1.9. They were starting to move up. And think of what happened. For 4 years, I wasn't able to remove any biomass from those cropland fields. It was all pounded into the soil. And then we also started growing the covers and grazing on the cropland, which not many people were doing. A lot of people, after a small grain harvest, would turn their livestock out on that cropland to graze, but they weren't planting cover crops like this to graze. So we started seeing an improvement in our soil health, and I wasn't even thinking. The term soil health wasn't even around back then, it seems. Nobody was talking about it anyway. But it really made me realize that through my previous practices, I had been degrading the resource. Those years when I was doing tillage, I was degrading my resource. The years I was planting monocultures, I was degrading my resource. Now, many of you in the room know Ray Archuleta, and Ray and I are good friends, and Ray put this slide together, and he titled it, "This soil is naked, hungry, thirsty, and running a fever." And I really like that slide because that depicts what's happening on bare soil. I really realized that I had come to accept that degraded resource. I know there's people sitting here right now listening to me who are saying, yeah, Gabe, you can do it in North Dakota, but you don't understand. This is our soils, this is what we have. Well, I'm sorry, but you need to understand that you can change, you can advance your soils. Yes, the basic makeup of your soil stay the same, but we can improve the organic matter infiltration, etc. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about. We can advance the health of our soils significantly. I also realized that what I was really seeing was a lot of symptoms of a degraded resource. And I just listed some of them here. But I don't care if we're talking lack of moisture, compaction, low fertility, salinity, too much moisture, too little moisture, on down the line. All those things are really just symptoms of a degraded resource. That's all we've been doing as producers is treating the symptoms. We're not solving the problem. In my mind then, I come to the conclusion that the current production model was only about killing. You were either going to kill weeds, you were going to kill pests, you were going to kill a fungus, but we also are killing our diversity, we're killing our soil, and we're killing our profit. Now, I couldn't find any projections for North Carolina, but this was the projections last year for North Dakota. The projected return of the major cash crops. Look at that. Every single one was a negative. Now, that really makes you want to run out and farm, doesn't it? Just a few months back, I was doing a workshop in Nebraska, and this was in corn bean country, irrigated land. The majority of producers there are very large farmers producing corn and soybeans. There was 525 plus producers there, and they were all complaining because they lost quite a bit of money on their corn crop that year. And so I polled them. I asked them, well, what are you going to plant next year? Well, corn. And I'm like, oh, in my mind, that's the definition of stupidity. I'm sorry, but it is, What effect does all this have then on our quality of life, our schools, our businesses, and our communities? We can't stay in this type of a production model. And I really think this really limits opportunities for the next generation. My son went to university and has several degrees, and he came back to the ranch, which we always knew he would, and I'm going to talk more about that this afternoon. But he finds it just sad that not a single one of his classmates in his inner circle, so to speak, is back directly related and working in agriculture. That's sad. There's tremendous opportunities in agriculture today if we change the way we look at things. And that's what happened to me. In 1997, I had the opportunity to attend my first holistic management conference. And there was a rancher from northern Alberta there by the name of Don Campbell. And Don made this statement, and I include it in every one of my presentations. He said, if you want to make small changes, change the way you do things. But if you want to make major changes, change the way you see things. And I'll never forget when he said that, because that was right after the third year of disaster, and I'm thinking, boy, I got to change the way I look at production agriculture. So there is another way of doing things. And that other way is about life. On the left there, you have a picture of Mars. On the right, you have a picture of the Earth. What's the difference between the two? The difference is life. It's all about life. Specifically, it's about doing things nature's way. And these principles that I'm going to share with you, this is how nature functions. Look at nature. In nature, there's no mechanical disturbance. We all agree on that. Now, there is some disturbances, you know, with a major hurricane or flood, etc. But there's no mechanical disturbance in nature. In nature, there's always armor on the soil surface. You look at how nature is. Yes, question.
Define armor.
Armor, I mean, and I'll explain that more coming up, but I mean cover on the soil. The soil is covered. Now you're going to say, well, but deserts aren't covered. But read the historical context. How many deserts were there really in this world? Very, very few. You know, the settlers, for instance, the first explorers that come into the area that is now Arizona, they talked about grass as high as the saddle on the horses. Do you see that today in Arizona? Hardly, right? So the soil was always covered. The other thing there was, nature cycles water very efficiently. You know, one of the big problems we're having all around the world today is a dysfunctional water cycle. You know, they talk about the Ogallala Aquifer and how that is being depleted rapidly. California is in a perpetual fight for water. Now all of a sudden they have major flooding. You know, wherever I go speak, water is becoming a critical issue. And we'll talk more about that. The other thing in nature, there's living plant root networks. And I mentioned mycorrhizal fungi. But there's many other networks that are happening due to the diversity. There's always something alive. You look where I'm from in North Dakota, and you see it here. When the snow leaves, you're going to have something as soon as the temperature gets warm enough that's green and growing. All the way up until the point that you have winter set in, right? There's always something growing. That's how nature functions. The only place there isn't, for instance, is like the field across the road here, where somebody's tilled it and purposely removed things from growing. That's not natural. Think of it this way. Why do weeds grow? You know, a farmer goes out and tills a field, what happens? Some weeds grow afterwards. Nature's trying to cover itself. Nature wants a living root in the ground at all times because that's how it works. That's how nutrient cycling occurs. And I'll explain more about that coming up. The other thing is, there's thousands of years of research and development. This is why I get upset at the words conventional agriculture. In Gabe's world, this is conventional agriculture. It's been around for eons of time. What we're doing is not conventional. We're trying to impose our will on nature, and we all see how that isn't working out, right? I like this photo. This is of this was taken, I believe, in Australia, and this is a old lake bed. That's sandy soil, high salt content soils. Yet, look at the top layer here. What's the difference? I mean, was there all of a sudden, you know, some storm came and deposited that amount of topsoil there on it? No. What's the difference? What's happening here?
Organic matter.
It's life. It's a growing plant. That's what made this. That's what changed it. That's how you can change your soils. I don't care if you're talking about in your garden, in your cropland fields, in your pastures, in your forest. You can change that because you can grow things. This really isn't rocket science, folks. It's simply following the principles of nature. Take a look at this photo. We've all driven in the mountains and seen where a tree is growing out of a rock, right? Is there a pocket of soil in that rock where that tree is growing? No, right? What's happening there? Plants take in CO2 from the atmosphere, correct? We can all agree on that. Photosynthesis occurs. Some of that carbon then, in other words, liquid carbon, that plant translocates to its roots where it is expelled out into the soil in order to feed biology. Here's a good example of that. This is a plant root. That is root exudates, in other words, liquid carbon, that is going out in the soil to feed biology. And it's the biology that runs its life cycle then that feeds the plant. This is how nature cycles nutrients. This is the way to take care and mitigate these climate challenges we're having now. Living plants can do it. I don't know how many of you, here's a way have tried or seen this type of an experiment, but I encourage you to do this on your own operation. Ray Archuleta did this, and he simply took this living cover, and this is from a cornfield. You just pull it up, some soil with some roots, and put it in some water. This takes about a minute, but where you can actually see that liquid carbon after doing this. And I encourage you to do it on your own operation because it does work. It just doesn't fail. What's going to happen is that liquid carbon will be released and you'll be able to see it here in this water. See that scum, that white foam? And there's a little bit over here, but you need the living root. See that? That's liquid carbon. That's CO2 out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis, going into the roots, and then being exuded into the soil. Now, a large part of that is consumed by microbes, but a small part of it is converted into carbonic acid. And it's that carbonic acid then that breaks down those rocks, making nutrients available, other nutrients, okay? So that's how that happens. So it all has to do with a living plant. Okay, this should play here. This is how alive our soils are. This is an air bubble in the soil. These are protozoa feeding on bacteria that are trapped against that air bubble. There's more microorganisms in a teaspoonful of healthy soil than there are people on this world. Yet how many of us as producers think about feeding that biology? On our operation, that's our number one goal, is to feed the biology. Because if we feed that biology, it's going to cycle the nutrients, making them available to us. And it's all types of biology that we have to focus on. Not only these microorganisms here, but all the macroorganisms also. So, how many of you, when you work with an agronomy center, how many of those agronomy centers talk to you about the life in the soil? How many talk to you about the fungal component in the soil? How many of your garden centers talk to you about fungal component in the soil? Plays a huge part in your profitability, yet they're not discussing it with you. I would fire them and find a different source for your inputs if you're using any. Okay? Why is fungus important in a soil? Mycorrhizal fungi secrete a glue called glomalin. It's a sticky substance that starts the formation of soil particles. So this is fungal hyphae, and those biotic glues start forming soil particles. You have to have them in order for soil particles to hold together. If not, there you have soil without life. You add the life to the soil with the mycorrhizal fungi and biotic glues, then you can truly form healthy, functioning soils. Soil should look like dark cottage cheese. This is what healthy soil should look like. Now, I guarantee if we go to any of the fields around here in North Carolina that have had excessive tillage, we're not going to see soil that looks like that. But Gabe, you don't understand. Our soils just aren't like that. No, you don't understand. Healthy soils are like that. Yes, the soils appear a little redder down here, but they're still going to look like cottage cheese if they're healthy. I'll talk more about this coming up. You have to have soil aggregates. A soil aggregate will only last approximately 4 weeks, and then new ones need to be formed. If we go out and continually till our soils, we're going to tear apart that mycorrhizal fungi, and there's no way it'll be there to exude those biotic glues. It also takes biology to build soil aggregates. Ray Archuleta said it best, plant and soil are one. It's kind of like the chicken and the egg. You have to have both. I don't know which came first, but growing topsoil is a biological process. And we can grow topsoil. You know, I so often hear, oh, it takes 500 years to grow an inch of topsoil. I don't believe that for a minute. We're doing it much, much, much quicker than that, using the template of nature to do so. Growing plants cycle carbon. That's the biggest problem we have with climate change, so to speak. We're not growing enough plants in this world. We're simply not. There's too long a time where lands are idle and there's not a living plant on it. Take a look at how we misuse carbon today. So in production agriculture, many producers are using synthetic fertilizers. That accelerates carbon release, okay? When you remove a crop, and I put combining here, I didn't have a picture of picking vegetables, it'd be the same thing. When you remove that edible portion, you're going to remove part of the carbon. Now, we all agree that's required for us to make a living, correct? So, okay, realize we're taking part of that carbon away by doing that. Then, lots of times, you remove the residue. If you're in cowboy country like I am, they'll bale everything. All that straw gets baled up, and you're hauling that off. Or if you put up hay and remove that hay off a field, you're removing a large part of the carbon. Now, in your gardens, if you're out there removing the plant material after the growing season, you're removing the carbon. Then what happens? Large-scale agriculture goes out and tills this way. In a garden, we're going in, and many people in rototilling. We're removing all the carbon that has been added that year by that growing plant. Okay? You're just going to keep going backwards. The answer then is a degraded resource. Question? Yes?
I have a question about the living root.
Okay.
If I have mostly perennial pastures, when that living root goes dormant, is it still count as a living root, or should I be having cover crops on there?
No, you should not. The question was, if you have a perennial pasture and that pasture goes dormant, that root and that plant are still functioning, okay? It is leaking small amounts in there. Now, I would say this much. Obviously, here in North Carolina, you're in a warm season environment. So most of your perennial pastures are going to be warm season based. But there should be a cool season component in there that will grow for a large part of the remainder of the year when that warm season perennial is dormant. One of the problems we've seen in perennial pastures is that many producers, they will just seed one species, a monoculture species in that plant, in that pasture, and it will not have the diversity. And if it doesn't have diversity, then you're going to run into that situation. So then you need to go in there and add like a cool season component. Now, I do not recommend normally going and tilling up perennial pastures. I mean, don't destroy the good that's already there, but you can do some interseeding into those. That was a good question. So we end up then, since we remove all that carbon, we have a degraded ecosystem. Don't care if you're talking on cropland, in a garden, on pasture land, hayland, it's a degraded ecosystem. I'm going to show you a series of slides here that compare 4 systems. Now, we can put this on a garden type scale too. We can talk about orchards. It's all relevant. This just happens to be in larger scale grain production. This series was done 2 years ago by a team of scientists. One of the benefits I have, since I got a big mouth and travel all over talking about this, I get a lot of scientists who come to our operation and they want to do research on my operation. Now, the majority of them will tell me, oh, you got to plant a monoculture here and you got to do this here. And I say, no, no, no. I'm going to run my farm as an ecosystem. If you can do research based on the way I operate, fine. If not, goodbye. And most of them drive away frustrated. But there are some who really grasp this and understand this, that our operations are ecosystems. So one such researcher is Dr. Rick Haney at Temple, Texas. He's a soil scientist. And he decided to compare operations in my area. So he looked at 4 producers, and all located within a few miles of my operation, all with basically the same soil types. So there wasn't variation there. Here's what we found. Okay, the first producer was an organic producer. Now this organic producer has a very diverse rotation. He grows spring wheat, winter wheat, sunflowers, dry edible beans, peas, barley, oats, alfalfa. Very, very diverse crop rotation, but heavy tillage. Now, to his credit, when you walk on his operation, you can at least hear and see life. There's insect activity, and he does try and grow some cover crops, but he's tilling repeatedly, before the cash crop, after the cash crop. Now, if you look at the soil, it just so happens that he had sunflowers growing. You see that surface area? It's capped. Because a bare soil, it's heated up, dried up, it's capped. You can also see the horizontal breaking where the tillage layers were. Now, infiltration rates, when we did infiltration rates on this field, it was just a little over 1/2 an inch per hour of water that could be infiltrated into this soil. You also could see that it was not real high in organic matter, and the test showed it was about 1.8% organic matter approximately. And I'd have to look at the test to be sure. But it was typical. Notice that if you look at the sunflower roots, they only penetrated as far as that tillage layer. That's all the further those roots could penetrate, and then they hit that hard pan and they just quit. And if you also notice, there's not a lot of soil aggregation there. You don't see those soil particles that I talked about. So you could certainly see why infiltration would be so poor. Okay, the next producer had practiced no-till for over 15 years, although I prefer to call it minimum till because he did have points on his seeder and he injected anhydrous ammonia. He only grew flax and spring wheat. Those are the only 2 crops he grew. With the exception of this year, he had seeded his spring wheat crop, and on May 22nd, we had 3.5 inches of rain in 45 minutes, and it washed his entire spring wheat crop away, and he had to plant sunflowers. So I told my son, see, Paul, that's God's way of making him get diversity, that rain event. But if you look, there's really not much difference. You'd swear that's the same soil types, right? You'd swear that's the same field. Capped on the surface, horizontal breaking, not much aggregation. Really not a lot of difference there. Infiltration rates were the same. Organic matter levels were slightly better on this field as compared to the organic producer with the heavy tillage. Third operation had been practicing no-till for 20 years. I called it medium diversity. They grow corn and sunflowers and malting barley, occasionally spring wheat, soybeans. So there's a little bit of diversity, but high use of synthetics. Fertilizers, pesticides, fungicides, tremendous use of synthetics. This is the poorest soil that Dr. Haney tested. That's like a brick. And the reason being, even though it's 20 plus years of no-till, that high use of synthetics. What does that do? Kills mycorrhizal fungi, kills soil biology. In my mind, this is more or less a hydroponic situation. The only purpose of that soil is to hold the plant upright because this soil is not transferring nutrients. This had the poorest water infiltration of any of those we tested, well under 1/2 an inch per hour. Okay? So when you hear producers out there talking about, oh, I'm no-till, does it matter? No. There's good no-till, poor no-till, good organic, poor organic. My whole point is it's the system. Fourth operation is ours. Now, we've been no-till, as I said, since '94. We integrate livestock. We have used 0 synthetic fertilizers since 2007. We have not used any pesticides or fungicides since before the turn of the century. We occasionally do use a herbicide. But look at the soil aggregation here. You know, how easy is it going to be for water to infiltrate? And I'll talk coming up about my water infiltration rates. How easy is it going to be for a new seedling to grow down in this soil, right? Those roots to penetrate that soil. The other thing is tremendous amount of soil life, and I'll talk about that. Now, when Dr. Haney analyzed this soil, he analyzes it for what he calls water extractable organic carbon. And think of it this way. Organic matter, we're all familiar with organic matter. Organic matter is the house that biology lives in. Water extractable organic carbon is the food. In other words, when I showed that root exuding those root exudates, that liquid carbon, that's what he's measuring for. How much food is there for the biology? So here's the test. This is pounds per acre of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And then over here is water extractable organic carbon. In other words, the food that biology eats. So the top line's the organic producer. Then we have the low diversity flax spring wheat producer. Then we have the high synthetic producer. Look at that. There ain't a lick of difference between those three producers. So in my mind, it doesn't matter if you're organic. It doesn't matter if you're low crop diversity. It doesn't matter if you're no-till for 20 plus years. It's what are you doing to treat your operation as an ecosystem. And the same thing holds true for your garden. These tests can be taken garden level too. Now the bottom line is ours. Okay, look at that. Nitrogen, I have 281 pounds per acre at the time of this sample sitting there. I can grow any cash crop I want and not have to add any synthetic nitrogen. Phosphorus, look at my phosphorus levels. For years, I was told by scientists, Gabe, your system is going to crash, you're going to run out of phosphorus and potassium. Really? I keep getting more every year. Now, technically, obviously, it doesn't appear out of nowhere, but what this is measuring is in the top profile. Our plant roots and biology make more of that available. They're converting the organic phosphorus into inorganic. They're bringing it up, making more of it available. Obviously, we're not multiplying it, okay? But look, I haven't added any yet. I can produce any crop and then some on those amounts. The most important thing in my mind, though, is right here. How much food do I have for soil life? Look at that, 5 times the amount of any of the other producers. Yes, sir.
Is yours just livestock, or do you also do grains?
Oh, no, we do a lot of grain farming. The question was, do I only add livestock? Are we grain farming? Yes, we are grain farming. Okay? Yes?
So are those numbers for perennial pasture? Or?
These numbers are off of cropland, because we were comparing like to like. So this is cropland acres. Perennial pasture, we have sampled our perennial pasture. That's a great question. They would be slightly lower here, because in our environment, in the northern plains, it was a low nitrogen environment. And most of the soils across North America were low nitrogen environments. One of the real, how do I say this, downfalls of the current production model is we're trying to outproduce our environment. We're trying to take an ecosystem that was at one time a low nitrogen system and to create a system of a cropping system that has very high nitrogen requirements. Okay? Yes?
So you have some pristine prairie. How
Yes.
does that correlate to your grazing land?
Yes, and that's a great question. So when we test our true native prairie, it's going to depend on management. As you increase stock density livestock numbers, you're gonna obviously be cycling nutrients faster, so it will up the numbers a little bit. They're not going to be as high as right here, but you're going to up them over a system that is low stock density and, or like a forested system without livestock integration. So our management has a lot to do with these numbers and how we can accelerate or decelerate nutrient cycling according to what we want to do. Hopefully that makes sense. Yes?
The organic farmer that tills,
Yep.
they're not using synthetic fertilizers, but are they like tilling in compost or something? Or?
He is not using compost. He's got almost 6,000 acres in organic grain production. You can't make enough compost to cover that many acres in our environment, you know. So what he's using is cover crops or green manure type crops like clover and plowing them down. But this shows you right here, that tillage pass, it'll just volatilize and you'll lose the majority of it. Because anytime you till, you're going to accelerate that.
So all he's
Decomposing.
adding is the cover crop.
Yep, or residues, yes. Now he does use some amendments like fish oil and rock phosphate and things like that. All three of these top ones are using some form of inputs. Now, technically I am a little bit here too because we do feed a little mineral to our livestock. But it's such a minute amount and I'll explain that coming up. Okay?
Yeah, can I ask a question about
Yes.
So just to make sure I understand your system, so you're taking cattle that are running on your prairie and then also running them on your cropland?
That's correct.
So
At
probably
times.
moving your
At
grains.
times. Now, we're way too big, and we're actually shrinking the size of our operation. We're at 5,200 acres. We were over 6,000. We only own 1,400, but we're letting a lot of that leased land go because we can't get over all our acres like we should. So yes, we're moving livestock on, but I don't want to give you the impression that it's all ultra high stock density on all the cropland acres. No, not going to happen. Not enough hours in the day.
My question was basically, like, do you think you're moving phosphorus and potassium from your prairie to your cropland?
Yes, no doubt that day of that move, but what about when they go from cropland back to prairie? They're taking it with them. So, you know, that's kind of a moot point because it's all one system. Yes. Good question, though. Okay, on our operation, we have accomplished this with zero added fertility, no microbials, no foliars, or any other input added to the system with the exception of seed, because I do buy cover crop seed, and a small amount of livestock mineral. Last year, we run a little over 300 cow-calf pairs. We run between 400 and 800 yearlings and grass finishers. We have a flock of sheep. We've got pastured pork. We've got 1,000 laying hens, plus some broilers. We use less than 1 ton of livestock mineral. So to say that's really adding, yes, it is, but a minute amount, okay? So the only compost we use, and I'll talk more about this later, is a little bit in our larger scale vegetable gardens. That's it. We don't use any out on the cropland field. Yes, ma'am.
How densely are you seeding a cover crop?
How densely? Yeah. That's a great question. It's going to do, seeding is more based on plants per square foot and according to what species you're planting. Because obviously some species stool more than others, spread out, some don't. I like to go by like wheat. Wheat in our environment, you're seeding about 1.2 million seeds per acre. Cover crop, we're going to seed at about 75% of that. So around 800,000 approximately seeds per acre. But it'll really depend on what species we're seeding. Okay? So my whole point of this previous testing is soil carbon is the key driver for the nutritional status of plants and therefore the mineral density in animals and people. Soil carbon is the key driver for moisture holding capacity. The more carbon you have in the soil, the more moisture you can hold in your soil. In other words, soil carbon is the key driver for farm profit. How many of you who deal with a garden center or agronomy center do they talk about carbon? You need to fire them and find one that does. It's all based on carbon. People want to know how we get our soils to that point, right there. It's all about growing things, taking carbon out of the atmosphere, putting it into the soil. I have the opportunity, I get on hundreds of operations all over North America every year. I can tell the potential profitability of any operation. I don't care if it's a grain farm, a livestock operation, a vegetable farm, an orchard. I can tell the potential profit of any operation by the amount of carbon they have cycling in their system. How good are they at taking carbon out of the atmosphere, putting it into the soil? If they're doing a good job, they're going to have a much higher profit potential as compared to other operations. And the road in here, you all saw the land right across the road here that was tilled, bare, nothing growing. Yet further up the road, we passed a field that had a nice lush stand growing on it of covers. Which one's cycling more carbon, right? Think of it this way. If you take a plant and then lay it here, dry it out, okay? After you remove the water from a plant, 97% approximately of that plant is made up of carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen. Okay? All of these elements are in the air, and they're all free. Think of that. So as producers, why don't we want to take advantage of that? Vegetable farmers, cash grain producers, why don't we want to take advantage of that? It's free, it's in the air. For years, when I was farming, quote unquote, conventionally, all I did was write checks. I got tired of writing checks. Why do I want to write checks for something that's free? Right? You need to not do that. Okay. What about micronutrients? People tell me, yeah, Gabe, that's some of the macros, but what about the micronutrients? I so wish when I started down this path in the 90s, I would have archived some of my soils because they were just dead and lifeless, and I didn't do that. I wish I would have done a micronutrient analysis on that. Now, a good friend of mine, Colin Seiss in Australia, he's been working with Dr. Christine Jones, who's one of the world's foremost soil ecologists. They were doing these long-term studies on Colin's place. So they had those soils sampled when Colin moved down this path, and they've sampled them recently. Here's what they found. This is the total amount of these nutrients and the available amount, in other words, the amount that's available for uptake by the plants, how much it's increased since he's moved down this path. Every single micronutrient they tested for is higher now than it was when he started. Colin's not adding it, okay? It's the plants and the soil biology that are making it more available. I just had a conversation with Dr. Jones 3 days ago, and I specifically asked her, I said, how many places are there in this world where there's production agriculture that we cannot profitably grow crops without added inputs? She told me there isn't any. She said everywhere in the world where there's production agriculture, you can get soil to function like this. Now, obviously, some soils are going to take longer. Yours here in North Carolina have been farmed much longer than mine have in the Dakotas. But you can advance soils drastically. You know, just up the road here, you got Ray Stiers, and who passed me the little sample there? Yeah, he passed me a sample of a cover crop seed mix this morning that's named after Ray Stiers. Ray has been doing this for 30 plus years without the added inputs. We can advance soils anywhere.
What was his name again?
This person, this is Colin Seiss. Oh, Ray Stier, S-T-Y-E-R. He's an elderly dairy farmer up there. Absolutely tremendous. I was on Ray's place in 2011. Looked at his soils, 4.5%, 5% organic matter soils. Just beautiful. Just beautiful. Yes.
Ray's Crazy Mix?
Yep. Okay. Ray's Crazy Mix, it's called. Yes. Look at what Colin's done in Australia, though. His soil now has over 200% more organic carbon. And it's amazing. I've stood in his pastures right here. We crossed the fence into his brother's land. It's night and day difference. Night and day difference. And all Colin's doing relates to your question earlier about growing things. Colin has, like you would hear, predominantly warm season pastures. He goes in the fall then and seeds cool season cash crops. So he's seeding into there, like oats or canola or rye, or now he's trying multi-species covers. But so he has something growing all year, and this is the result. So for gardeners out here, or those in vegetable production, why wouldn't you want to do that on your garden? And I'll talk a little bit about what we do in our environment later on. But always, always have something growing. There's a lot of organic producers up my way now who are in vegetable production. What they're doing is they're actually taking one plot of land, making it a cover crop year, growing their vegetables on the other plot, and then they're switching every other year. And it's amazing. They say their profitability is much, much greater now because the soil health's improved. And most importantly, the nutrient density of those vegetables, the produce that they're growing, is much higher because you have more nutrient cycling. Questions?
Are they plowing?
Are they plowing that in? No, what we're strong, now some of them are, but they're not going to advance as far as those that, in our environment, we get to use winter to kill most everything, you know. In environments that aren't as cold, they're rolling it down with a crop roller, and they're terminating it that way. Now you're going to have to be careful which species you used, so it can be terminated by rolling. Obviously you wouldn't put a perennial species in there, but you can grow species that can be easily rolled down. So, how did our operations grow soils? Simply by following those principles of nature. That's how we did. So this is our ranch sign as you pull into my yard. We try very hard to explain to people what we're doing. We're focused on regenerative agriculture. That's what we're focused on. And I'll talk more about that coming up. This last summer, we had a little over 2,100 visitors through the yard, and I want everybody that pulls onto our place to know that's our focus. You know, I get real tired of the word sustainability. Why in the world would I want to sustain a degraded resource? That ain't going to get me anywhere. I need to be regenerative so that future generations can have the opportunity to be sustainable, okay? But we need to regenerate our soils. So, this is my cash flow statement. I know that's a little hard to see. But we start with carbon, soil, water, sunlight. We grow cash crops, cover crops, perennials. And I'm going to get in depth with this afternoon. Here's all of our income streams that we have. So these principles will work anywhere in the world where there's production agriculture on any size scale. So I have had visitors to our operation that have a windowsill planter box, and they're using these principles, okay? From there up to, I've had producers that farm over 1 million acres on our operation. They're using these principles. So don't get it in your mind that they won't work on your operation. You know, it was once said, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're correct. And I really believe that. The people I speak to, you know, those that are making it work are those that want to make it work. Those that are saying, oh, it doesn't work, they don't want to make it work. You know, they just don't want to apply the principles. So now I'm going to share with you those 5 principles of creating a healthy soil. The first we talked about was least amount of mechanical disturbance possible. Now, see this photo here? That's off of one of our native pastures. I tell people I bought that land for 2 reasons. Number 1, it has a tremendous amount of diversity on it. Number 2, because with that many rocks, I'd never be tempted to till it, you know. And that we have rocks, you know. If you want to see rocks, come to our place. There's a commonality among tillage tools, and I stole this slide from Dr. Dwayne Beck. He runs Dakota Lakes Research Farm in South Dakota. He's kind of known as the godfather, so to speak, of no-till in North America. All tillage tools destroy soil structure. There's no arguing that point. They do. As we till, we're going to destroy the soil aggregates. We're going to destroy infiltration. All tillage tools reduce water infiltration. All tillage tools reduce organic matter. And that was the question earlier about the organic producer, and he's plowing in these covers, but the problem is, through tillage, it's going to volatilize, and you will accelerate decomposition of the organic matter. Remember I said on our operation, Northern prairie soils were in the 7 to 8% organic matter range. When I started, those soils were then 1.7 to 1.9. That was due to the tillage. The more you till, the more you're going to decrease organic matter. All tillage increases weeds. Temporarily, it'll kill some weeds, but what is nature trying to do? Cover the soil. If tillage really controlled weeds, why do you got to till more than once? Right? You know, nature tries to put armor on the soil and have a living root in the soil at all times. That's why weeds grow. I really like this series of photos here. This was taken from out east here. A producer had a forested area. He cleared part of that forested area and farmed it monoculture soybeans for 17 years. Organic matter levels went from 4.3% down to 1.6%. This is the same soil. I so wish I would archive some of my soils when I started, because this is how they looked. How much water is going to infiltrate into that soil? How much carbon is there in this soil to feed soil life? How many pore spaces are here to house biology? The majority of biology, microbiology in the soil, live in and on films of water surrounding those soil aggregates. If you don't have soil aggregates, you got no home for the biology. If you don't have a home for the biology, you're not going to cycle nutrients. That's how soil becomes dysfunctional. Now look at it magnified. Which of these is going to infiltrate water? We can sure see that, right? See the pore spaces where all the biology can live? If a new seedling starts here, how easy will it be for that root to go down, cycle nutrients? How about over here? You know, think of those photos I showed of the 4 producers. This is what it is. This is what we're doing by our management practices. Here's another example of it. The top half is tilled soil. The bottom half is not tilled. There's a huge difference there, right? We bring this upon ourselves by our management practices. I showed you this when I talked about the organic producer and then the minimum till producer. Look at that crust on the soil surface. And I see this often as I travel really anywhere in North America, but specifically in the eastern half of the United States. I often see this in the cornfields, that type of crust forming. How's water going to infiltrate in there? The other thing, we'll talk about temperatures coming up. So, I showed you a picture of this was the first no-till drill I've owned. I have a 20-footer now, but the same basic concept. This is a no-till planter that we use. This is the type of residue I like to plant into. And I'll talk more about that coming up. No, that's what 70 plus inches of snow does. Yeah. We use winter to our advantage, you know. Okay, here's where I went through with my drill. This is after I seeded. If you look close, you can see the rows right here. There's another one right there. That's in 7.5 inch spacing. That's the type of armor I want on the soil surface. Organic producers, it's critical that you minimize tillage. And it just so happens I started working with a couple of large producers here, one in Georgia, where we're working on an organic no-till operation. We're not going to call it no-till because we're still going to use a tillage pass to take perennials out, to put it in annuals, but then we're going to no-till for multiple years. We need to reduce the tillage passes. It is possible to grow vegetables without tillage, and I'm going to show you how we do it. Here's how my friend Gabe Brown does it. That's his no-till precision pumpkin planter right there. Here's a close-up view of it. See, he just has the same type of opener on that as is on my no-till drill. Now, he uses a wavy coulter up in front. I wouldn't use that. I don't like that. That's too much tillage. But here's what he's able to do. He no-tills pumpkins into there. This is in a rolled-down cover. Yes?
What company is that?
He built that himself.
Oh.
Yeah, he built that himself. But there's not much to it. And you know, you can do it. Here's what it looks like a little later in the season. Notice no weed pressure there due to the rolled down cover. There's what it is right before harvest. Works. Okay? I'm going to show you this. These next slides are for my place. This is my no-till potato production. All we did, we took some compost, spread it out there, placed the potato sets on top, started the tractor with a round bale of hay, rolled it over the top of it. There's just a picture a little later. We just finished doing it. There's a little later in the season, same potatoes. Come back in the fall, you peel the hay back, there's your potatoes. Now, I want to tell you, you got to make sure that that hay is not real thick to start, because those are pretty tender shoots coming out of those potatoes. So you want to keep it thin. When you unroll a hay bale, there's going to be spots that are too thick. So we just go, and that's what my son was doing, take a little of it off there, and then it comes through just fine, and then we got our potatoes. Are you going to do it? Will those potatoes be as large and, as prolific as if they were in the ground? No, but I don't care. This is really easy, and it works well, and I don't have to till, so it works. Yeah, works well. Okay. Question the rationale of this. I'm going to talk about my neighbor. He's not here, and I doubt he's ever watched a video, because if he hasn't watched one of my YouTube videos in the last 20 years, he isn't going to start now. Every fall, this road here separates his place, mine's on the other side of the road. Every fall, he goes and tills this low spot right here. Has for over 30 years. Every spring, he'll go in there and get it seeded. Then we get a little rain, ½ inch, and that's what happens. All of a sudden, he's got a duck pond there, okay? Here's an actual photo taken June 15, 2009. I took it from the front porch of my house. They were forecasting major rainfall event. We thought ½ inch, the Weather Service gets carried away, it'd be a ½ inch. Started raining at about 5:30, 6 o'clock in the evening. By midnight, we had 12.2 inches, 6 hours. We ended up getting another little over an inch the next morning. We had 13.6 inches in 22 hours. Jay Fear, who's the district NRCS soil conservationist in our county, came out that morning and took this photo. That's my farmstead in the background. Now, there is some slope there, nothing like the slope you guys have, but there is slope there. I'm a little embarrassed. There's a little bit of bare soil here, but it doesn't look bad for 13.6 inches of rain, does it? 22 hours? Now, he dug down in the soil. This is the photo he took. So that photo I showed you earlier of the pore spaces, that's my soil after 13.6 inches of rain. Jay makes the comment, and he tells many people, you could have drove across this field with a truck that day and not rutted it up. Where once I could only infiltrate ½ inch an hour, now I'm able to do this. Now, did I infiltrate all 13.6 inches? No, but what could move through the soil, it infiltrated, then moved throughout the soil profile. Here's what I can do now. This is an inch of water now. This is how fast I can infiltrate an inch of moisture. The answer is 9 seconds. The second inch, I can infiltrate it in 16 seconds. So 2 inches of rainfall in 25 seconds. That's the same scientists that did those soil tests took this. And they videotaped it, and I'll never forget, because they drove immediately up to the house and said, you got to see this. We just can't believe it. And they said, we did it multiple times. I'm not going to say that all my soils are like that, but we certainly have some of them like that. So where I once started with only ½ inch per hour, now I can infiltrate 2 inches in 25 seconds. We only get 10 to 11 inches a year. It's not how much rainfall you get. How much can you infiltrate into the soil? And then, due to the amount of organic matter you have, you'll hold for when you need. We create most of our own droughts by our management. I was out in California putting on a workshop, and you don't understand, we're in a drought. I said, really? Well, what's rainfall? We've only had 30 inches this year. And I'm like, and how much have you infiltrated? And when you do infiltration tests out there, well under an inch an hour. They think they're in a drought, but they've destroyed their soil resource, so they cannot infiltrate what water they do get. That's the key. I don't care if we're talking in a garden, in a large-scale grain operation, in a nursery, whatever the case may be.
appreciate the potential runoff and erosion from a conventionally tilled field like this, you really need to be out here during the most intense thunderstorm of the year. Since most people aren't willing to do that, here in Virginia we use a rainfall simulator to help our farmers tell the story of what happens when it rains really hard. On the left, we start with a tray of dry, loose soil taken from a clean till field. On the right, we start with a slice of intact surface soil from a long-term no-till field. This soil is not only protected with a mulch of cover crop residue, it also has a stable, porous sponge structure.
You know, years ago, as a kid, I remember, you know, you'd get these big, heavy thunderstorms in the summer, and it would just wash the field, and you'd end up with mud down the road. And I'm talking about mud that you'd go over there with a skid loader and scoop out of the way so the cars could go down the road. What I'm seeing now is I'm seeing these heavy rainfalls, and I'm barely seeing a trickle coming out of the field.
After we simulate an extremely intense thunderstorm for 5 minutes, the differences are obvious. Most of the water we applied to this soil has run off into this jar, carrying away with it a thin but very significant layer of topsoil.
What else ran off? All the nutrients, right?
We just applied 1.5 inches of very intense rainfall to this bare, tilled soil. Obviously, we harvested very little for future plant use.
So why do we till our gardens?
Meanwhile, this no-till soil has absorbed virtually every drop of water we applied. What little ran off is clear. The bottom line is pretty simple. If you want to harvest more rain like these no-till farmers are doing, keep your soil covered on top and make it a sponge underneath.
If you have too much water, you need to increase your crop intensity. In other words, grow cover crops to utilize that water to cycle carbon. If you don't have enough water, you need to increase the water holding capacity of your soil. The only way to do that is by growing something. Taking CO2, increasing organic matter in your soils. Approximately 2/3 of the organic matter increase in soils comes from roots. You got to grow something. That's the whole key. See, it's totally antagonistic to what we've been taught for the last 50 to 70 years. It's just wrong. It's only going to happen if you have good soil aggregation and structure. One must have high populations of mycorrhizal fungi. In 2003, I had the real good fortune that this lady came to work for the ARS station, Mandan, North Dakota, which is only about 20 miles from my ranch. It's Dr. Chris Nichols. She was working with Dr. Sarah Wright at Beltsville, Maryland, when Dr. Wright discovered glomalin. Dr. Nichols came out to my place and she said, "Gabe, you've advanced your soils, but you'll never truly be sustainable until you eliminate your synthetic inputs." So what I did then, realized I went through those 4 years of hail and drought. I couldn't afford much synthetics. Once I got through that, I started adding back some synthetic fertilizer. Then she came in 2003 and told me that. So the years 2004 through 2007, I did split trials on some of my cropland. I was never fertilizing near full rates, or what recommended rates I should say, of synthetics, but I was fertilizing some on my cropland. I took part of the field and I would apply synthetic fertilizer. I took the other part of the field, no synthetics. All 4 years, the non-fertilized was equal or greater in yields to the fertilized. So I quit. So we haven't used any synthetics since 2007. Now, I tell producers today, I in no way am I here to tell you if you're using synthetic fertilizer, whether it be on your gardens or on your cropland fields, to quit using it immediately. Soil's like a drug addict. You're not all of a sudden going to have this population of biology that'll take care of it. You got to wean yourself off it slowly. But that's where Dr. Haney's test, the Haney test, works so well. Because you can test your soils, and you can do it in a garden environment, you can do it in pastures, you can do it on cropland. Take a soil sample, send it to a lab that does the Haney test. It will give you a real good indication of the health of your soil, the respiration of it, and how much biology you have working for you in it. So that's what I recommend. And then you wean yourself off it slowly. And it works. How are you going to know if it works or not unless you try it on your operation? And you know, it all depends on, people always ask me, well, how much should I try it on? What'll allow you to sleep at night? You know, there's guys like me who I'll just do it on everything because I just know it'll work. But a lot of people, you know, they're going to do it over the hill in the back 40 where none of the neighbors will see. See, on my operation, I-94, the interstate running through North Dakota, is right on the south side of my land. I want to do every experiment right there so every person can have something to talk about, you know? I want them to be able to see. First time I ever grew sun hemp, I don't know, there were so many skid marks on the highway. I don't know who was stopping more, the hippies or the highway patrol, you know? I don't know who, but anyway. I mentioned we eliminated our synthetics. What this has allowed then, yes, we were already no-tilling our soils. But remember my neighbor there, long-term no-till, but he didn't have, his soil structure was terrible. I told you the porous soil we tested. Synthetics also affect mycorrhizal fungi. Okay? So when I started backing off the synthetics, I noticed another advancement in soil health because my soils were now able to start aggregating again. And we were starting to get that structure. Mycorrhizal fungi build soil aggregates. This is a great picture, I think. This is a pine seedling here. There's the main roots of this pine seedling. All of this is mycorrhizal fungi. Mycorrhizal fungi has the ability to form that association with certain plant species, and it transfers nutrients to that plant species. In turn, the plant is feeding that mycorrhizal fungi carbon, CO2. You know, I get a kick today, there's all this technology. Oh, we need this variable rate fertilizer application, you know, so we can precisionally put these nutrients right where we need them to be. Dr. Chris Dean Jones, one of the world's foremost authorities on mycorrhizal fungi, will tell you these have the ability, one single fungi, to cover thousands of acres if you don't disturb it. So on my operation, I don't worry about any of that. For one thing, I'm not going to apply the synthetics. But why would I when the fungi will transfer the nutrients for me? You know, and you want to Google mycorrhizal fungi on YouTube, there's some really great videos where they went and they took radioactive isotopes and they put it in a tall tree out on the west coast in the forest out there. And they came back, I don't remember exact days, 3 days or a week later, and they found those isotopes had spread to all the seedlings around there through mycorrhizal fungi. Transfer of nutrients. It's absolutely amazing what plants will do. The other thing certain species of mycorrhizal fungi have the ability to do is they move in and occupy this, they move in through the cell walls, and this depicts a root and the cells in a root. They move in and occupy that space. If that space is occupied by mycorrhizal fungi, then that plant is not as susceptible to pathogens and nematodes. So it also acts as a defense mechanism for the plants. Yes?
I'm assuming this fungi is naturally occurring, or does it come with certain plants?
No, it is naturally occurring in native areas. You know, like if you have a road ditch or a hedge line along your fields, it's going to move out from there. But we can't kill it. You can't rip it apart with tillage, and you can't feed it synthetic fertilizers because that will have a negative response then to it. Now, the unfortunate thing about it is there's Dr. Wendy Tahari is in Georgia. She set up a lab that tests different cultivars and grains if they're able to form that symbiotic relationship with mycorrhizal fungi. What she has found is a startling number of the quote-unquote improved varieties we have of corn, wheat, etc., are no longer have the ability to form that association. So in other words, and I'm sure they didn't do it on purpose, but the plant breeders, they're so focused on yield, they forgot about that association in the soil. Now those plants no longer have that ability. That's one of the reasons on my operation, I'll talk a little bit about it later this afternoon, we keep as much seed back as we can from our own operation. You know, I have like hairy vetch that I've bred up over the past 20 plus years. I know it can form that association, you know, that those species are acclimated to my environment. And I think that's a lost art. We forgot how to keep our own seed. Vegetable producers should be doing that. They need to be keeping their own seed. Now, I'm going to show you another interesting series of slides. This is Dr. David Johnson. He's at New Mexico State University. He did some research. He wanted to find out if a new plant, what's the most important thing to it? Is it nitrogen? Is it phosphorus? Is it potassium? Is it organic matter? What's going to determine the health of that plant? You know, is it a tomato plant, a carrot? What's going to determine the health of that plant early in its life stage? Now, you need this is correlation factors here. You need a factor of about 0.8 to really be significant. Look at that, nitrogen, 0.001. That doesn't matter for early health in a plant. Phosphorus, 0.041, doesn't matter at all. Potassium, 0.003, that doesn't matter. Organic matter, 0.12, matters a little bit, but not really. What matters the most? This is fungal to bacterial ratio of your soils. 0.04, look up here at 3.68. These seedlings were all seeded the same day. Look at that. What matters most is how much fungi do you have in your system. What kills fungi? Tillage, synthetic fertilizers, chemicals, pesticides, right? What are we doing in our gardens? We're tilling, rototilling, you know, right? And we wonder why we don't have healthy plants, seedlings right away. It's not fertilizer, it's fungus. Yes?
Do you think the depth of tillage will affect that if you just do light tillage on the close to the surface?
The question was depth of tillage, will it matter? The majority of the biology in the soil live in the top 2 inches. Okay? Now, there's some down further, but the majority are right up there near the surface. So that's the problem then. Yes?
So do like germinating mixes contain mycorrhizae, or should you buy, because you can actually buy it and mix it in?
The question is, you can buy mycorrhizal fungi. You need to ask the experts about that. I believe there's good mixes out there and there's not good mixes. I spoke to Dr. Tahari herself about that. She said, Gabe, the species we really need, she says, they have not been able to propagate in large numbers yet. That's what she told me. I am not an expert on this. I'll tell you what I do when we make our compost, where the vegetable gardens go, because we apply that compost on there. I use a 2-year process. I go out to my native pastures, because healthy native pastures are going to have that fungi in them. I take several bucket loads of soil. I mix it in with my compost and leave it sit a year so it proliferates throughout. So then I'm inoculating my gardens with it. That's what I'm doing. I am not using any of the bought-in fungus. It may be, some are out there, might be good, I don't know. I can't make that recommendation to you.
Gabriel,
Yes.
Are you also relying on the synergy of the diversity of your cover crops to help get the fungi out there on the farm?
The question was, will the diversity of my operation help get fungi out there? Absolutely. Absolutely. The more species diversity, the more that's going to proliferate mycorrhizal fungi. Same with a living root in the ground as long as possible. That's why we can't let our gardens go idle for a part of the year. If you're able to grow something, unless you're like we are, 20 below zero, you know, you need to be growing something on there as long as possible, and I'll get to that. But this was a real eye-opener for a lot of us, that fungal to bacterial ratio. We hadn't been talking about that. Yes? A measurement. Just so happens, my next slide, okay? This is a soil food web analysis. These were taken way back in 2005. Now, realize forested areas like you have here in the Carolinas are going to be much more fungal dominant than we are on the northern plains. We're going to be more bacterial dominant. So that's an advantage to your soils right off the bat. Now realize if you've tilled that for years and years, you've destroyed it. The good news is it'll be able to move in if you're close to a forested area. So here's one of my neighbors back in 05. He had a bacterial count, total bacteria of 2243, fungal of 205. So he was 10 bacteria for every one fungal. Totally opposite of where you want to be. This is really common in the northern plains. You know, a lot of people I get asked all the time, Gabe, what soil test should I be taking? The best soil testing tool you have is a shovel. Take a shovel and go look at your soil. Is it aggregated? What does it smell like? Is there pore spaces there? Is there earthworms there? You can tell these things. I can tell more from a shovel than I'll tell by a soil test. Now, back in 05, this was my fungal to bacteria, right across the road from the neighbors. I was at 405 bacteria, 274 fungal. About 1.5 to 1, a little under that. So I'm getting a lot better. I have not tested it lately. I need to do that. But you can test for that. So how do we increase mycorrhizal fungi? Reduce or eliminate chemicals, reduce, eliminate tillage, reduce, eliminate synthetic fertilizer, living plant cover as long as possible throughout the year. This is not rocket science. Yes?
I think you said it, but I missed it from the previous slide. What's a good goal for fungal to bacteria over here?
Yeah, you want to be 1-to-1. Good goal, fungal bacteria is 1-to-1. Just as close to it as you can. And in your forested areas, you may actually get stronger on fungal than bacterial, and that's a good thing. Now realize there's many types of fungi, you know, and there's fungi that are harmful too. But we're going to concentrate on mycorrhizal fungi, good fungi. There's certain plant species that are more mycorrhizal compatible than others, and I've just listed a few of the common ones. Oats, barley, flax, your clover, sunflower. They'll really jumpstart mycorrhizal fungi. So what I do, if there's times I take over a new parcel of cropland, we'll actually go in there the first year and we'll plant a cover crop mix that's high in those species, just to proliferate mycorrhizal fungi. Now, many of your brassicas are not mycorrhizal compatible, so keep that in mind, okay? Now, how fast can you heal soils? So there was a producer in Kansas who decided to go down this soil health path. To his father's credit, his father said, okay, if you want to do that, you can take part of the farm, and you know, they were into heavy tillage, monoculture production, synthetics. He went in, no-till, cover crops. There's 3 years differences. 3 years, that's the same soil. This is Michael's, Russell. That's Michael's photo. Look at that. In 3 years, it's easy to tell which of those soils has more carbon, which is going to infiltrate water, which is going to cycle more nutrients. I'm not going to say we can move all soils that fast, but you can definitely move them in the right direction fairly quickly. Okay. Next tenet of soil health, armor on the soil surface. Look at true native ecosystems. This is one of our native prairies. That's a ranger sitting behind there. That's native prairie in North Dakota. That soil is always covered. There's armor on it protecting it. Here's my neighbor, the organic producer, who I showed the soil test from. If rain falls pretty fast, hits that soil, what's going to happen there? Remember that little video I showed, rainfall simulator? Rain falls on here, what's going to happen? Shielded, protected, right? Showed this before. Soil is naked, hungry, thirsty, and running a fever. The water's going to run off there. Showed this of me planting through that residue. There's the planter. There's the drill again. What difference does that make? Now, We can get hot up there. I know you'll laugh, but we actually can in late July and August, but not near as hot as you get down here. What difference does that make? This was a 90+ degree day in North Dakota. We had a tour out on my place. We went where there was cover. The soil temp was 87.6 degrees. Where there was no cover on the soil, we were at 107 degrees. About 20 degrees difference. What difference does that make in production? That residue is going to buffer that heat. Look what happens. Start at the bottom here. A plant likes a soil temp of about 70 degrees. If that soil temp is 70 degrees, that plant is going to use about 100% of the moisture that day for growth, okay? As the soil temp rises, at 100 degrees, that plant's only using 15% of the moisture. The rest is being evaporated away. So on that 94-degree day, look at, we were at 107 degrees where there wasn't good armor, residue on the soil. That plant's shutting down and it's not growing. If it's not growing, it's not cycling carbon out of the atmosphere. It's not making me money. And I don't care whether we're talking a vegetable or a grass in a pasture or a corn crop. Same thing, right? Now, once we get up much higher than that, we're starting to kill soil life. And that's the biggest problem that I see. There's a lot of times I can go out into tilled fields, such as the one across the road here. On a hot day, that might be 150+ degree soil temp. You're killing biology, the same biology that's going to fertilize your plant. Okay? Makes no sense. We're shooting ourselves in the foot. Why do we want to do that? So, on that 94-degree day, we turned over some of the residue. Look at the earthworms here. 94-degree soil temp, and I've got earthworms cycling nutrients for me. You brush aside the cover crop, that's solid earthworm castings there. I tell people, when I bought that farm, I could never go fishing because you'd never find an earthworm. Now, you see earthworms like that all the time, you know. When you seed vegetable or whatever in the spring, where's that root going to go down? It's going to follow those earthworm channels right down, picking up all those nutrients, right? That's a good thing. And it's free. All I got to do is provide a home for them, and they're there working. I'm going to show this short video of worms at work, and I don't know how many of you have seen this, but this is pretty good. So they layered sawdust and some compost. And this is the earthworms eating that sawdust over a period of days, if you look in the lower left there. This takes a few minutes, but look at that. Isn't that amazing? If you have a healthy population of earthworms, what will that do to your soils? Yeah, what are we doing with tillage, with synthetics? What are we doing to our soils? Do I ever need to bring in earthworms? I never, ever had. They just spread and come. Yep, build it and they'll come. No doubt about it. Look at that. By day 18, you couldn't even tell that. That's pretty amazing, I think. Yes?
So when you're transitioning from your cash crop to a cover, you're able to put the cover down without doing any tillage as well? Correct. You're drilling that cover in?
We're drilling the cover directly in. We haven't tilled anything since 1993 was the last tillage pass. No reason to till. Yes?
So you said we're going from a perennial to annual scenario, say vegetable production.
Yep.
And you have to do sometimes one tillage pass?
That's the system I'm designing for the organic producers. In order to meet the organic label. If you're not organic, you know, the only way to make that work like Colin does, my environment it won't work in because it's too short a time. You know, all of our growing occurs in just this much of the year. You know, we don't have a warm or cool season. You know, we've got winter and July. You know, that's it. So you need to, down here it would. If you have a solid warm season perennial mix, a perennial pasture, you could theoretically no-till cool seasons directly into that. And there's people starting to do that. Russell, do you know of anyone down here working like that, on that? No, doing a Colin size scenario, cool seasons into warm season perennial pastures.
Very little.
Very little? Okay, Laura.
There's a dairyman south of here, an hour and a half, who has been doing pasture crop.
Oh, I've read about him.
Forages.
And his name?
name's Tom Trampo.
Yeah, I've read about him. Yep.
So he's been doing it 30 years.
Yep.
So, and he's in Piedmont, South Carolina.
There you go. There you go. So it can be done. But realize you have to have, you either have to have all warm seasons, then you interseed cool seasons in them, or in the northern environment, you have all cool seasons, you interseed warm seasons in them. The problem up our way is there's just not enough growing season.
But in terms of vegetable production,
Yep.
you're aiming to do vegetables. If you're going from that perennial side to vegetables, how would you approach that?
Okay, and you no longer want your perennials in there?
Well, with some rotation.
Yeah. Then you got two choices. It's either herbicide or tillage. That's your two choices. So I speak at a lot of organic conferences, and I tell them, I understand that's where your tillage pass is going to be. Just realize you're setting all this back. Okay? You're setting back the time clock, so to speak. I've seen where one tillage pass, it takes 20 years to where you can, until you can no longer see where that pass was. So that's, in my mind, that's the problem with organic agriculture then, is that we have to figure out how we can do that without that tillage pass, and I'm working on that. We're very close on our operation to being organic no-till. Yes?
Do you think strictly in terms of soil biology, if you were to spray to kill that perennial, that would have less of an effect on them?
Would spraying have less effect on soil biology? Yes, depending on which herbicide. We don't use glyphosate at all. That's a no-no on our operation. There's many problems with glyphosate. It's a chelator, it's a biocide, etc. All herbicides will have some negative effect. Don't get me wrong. I'm not advocating for using herbicides over the tillage. That's just a decision you have to make, There is no perfect world. I haven't found it yet. I have not found anyone yet who has made organic no-till work. We're really close, but we've been working on it a long time too. Yes?
What about a rotation like cover crop, livestock, cover crop, vegetable?
Hey, the question was, Rocco asked, a rotation of cover crops with livestock integration, then vegetables. Work fantastic. It'll work fantastic. And there's ways you can use livestock then. It'll advance your soil health further, and I'll talk about that coming up. But you can also use it to terminate the cover crop. You won't be perennials then. It'll be all annuals.
It's all annual,
Yep.
and it's something we're working on here.
Yeah, and that's great. You can certainly do that.
And you got to get that one lick on it to get it established, and you kind of have to keep those cover crops going.
Yep.
But through crimping or animal.
Yep, and it's certainly possible. It's certainly possible to do that, yes.
So in that kind of scenario he's mentioning, if you're using pigs to turn stuff up, have you seen anything? I mean, they look certainly as destructive as a tiller. Have you seen any measurements or observations?
Yeah, we've been doing that, and I'll be very honest, we're removing the pigs from the cover crops now. We're going to put them back on the perennial pastures where we had them in past years. We tried it on annual cover crops. It'll work if you have the manpower to move them almost daily. But you leave them for more than like 2-3 days, look out. A pig is a pig, Put lipstick on it, but it's still a pig, So, yeah. Other questions? All right. Okay, I'm going to show a series of slides here that really show the importance of diversity, and that's the third tenet of soil health, is diversity. So, in 2006, I was attending a No-Till on the Plains conference, and I met this man. This is Dr. Ademir Caligari from Brazil. In my mind, he's the world's foremost authority on cover crops. He's worked in well over 60 countries all over the world, working on improving soil health through cover crops. Dr. Caligari said two things that day that really struck me. He said, you give me 2 inches of precipitation a year, 200 inches, anywhere in between, I'll grow you a cover crop. And I'd been growing covers in North Dakota, but not to the extent I did since I met Dr. Caligari. The other thing he said is cover crops are meant to be seeded in multi-species combinations. I'll never forget when he said that, because I hit myself in the head and I said, Gabe, you idiot. Look how native prairie works. Native prairie is tremendously diverse. Yet, I was only growing covers in 2- and 3-way combinations. People thought I was crazy then. Well, what we decided to do, and by we I mean the Burleigh County Soil Conservation District, we had some plot land located a mile south of my ranch. Now, the winter of 05-06 was really abnormal for us. We didn't have a lot of snowfall. So we were seeding in May into pretty dry conditions. We decided we'd seed these cover crops as monocultures, and then we'd mix them together as multi-species combinations. Now, there was only an inch of rain from the time these covers were seeded up until July 31st when these photos were taken. So that's the monoculture of turnip on July 31st. Right next to it, you had a monoculture of radish. Same thing, all dried up. On down the line we went until we got to the diverse polyculture mixes. Now look at that. Now for years, everybody's been telling us, oh, you got to keep your fields clean and you can't have any competition. Really? Is that how nature functions? Now, the staff there at the soil district went and clipped the biomass and weighed it. We over tripled biomass where we had the diversity. Now, Dr. Nichols explained it this way, and she's talking about mycorrhizal fungi. Not only do the fungi provide for the needs of one plant, but that fungal hyphae pipeline connect to multiple plants, thus supplying the nutritional and energy needs of both microorganisms and the plants. So see, that's how nature works in adverse situations. These plants form a symbiotic relationship that benefit all. Now, I got these photos from Canada just a year ago. This is a triticale field. Looks pretty pathetic, right? Not going to be much crop to harvest there. Look, it's barely headed out. See a lot of bare soil. Okay. Here's a diverse polyculture. See the triticale in that's all headed out? Looks healthy, right? What's amazing is they're side by side. Planted the same date. That is just amazing when you look at it. Now think of the ramifications on production agriculture. You can, and I'll show you what we're doing. We're planting multi-species, so whatever cash crop's taller, the cover crops stay lower and you can combine. But this is the synergies we need to be taking advantage of. In the pink there, that's Dr. Yamili. She was responsible for that. Look at that. That's just absolutely mind-blowing. You know, that's how nature functions, yes.
Are you broadcasting the mix that's really thick and you're row seeding the...
No, that's all seeded together in rows. It's all in rows there. Let me go back one more. That's all seeded. You can see it's in rows. Just the diversity makes it look like it's solid seeded. Yep, it's all seeded together in rows. And I'll show that when I talk about cover crops in a bit. Okay? So, yes, another question.
So does that mean that you should let weeds grow?
Not necessarily let weeds grow. Why not let grow what? Weeds are certainly better than nothing. But why not put in there what you want to grow? You know, to take advantage of that. And I'll show you an example of that. It'd be my no-till garden. This is how we do vegetable production on our place. Okay, this is sweet corn here on 30-inch rows. But then between the sweet corn rows, I have rows of peas and beans. So I can still harvest it. This is all hand harvested. But I can still harvest it easy because the row is a monoculture. But right next to it, I have the diversity. So here I have legumes growing right beside the corn. The legumes are bringing in nitrogen, transferring it to the corn. The corn is cycling deep-rooted phosphorus, transferring it to the legumes. I'm taking advantage of the same synergies here as they were here, okay? Except I'm doing it in a way that I can harvest it easier. Does that make sense? Monocultures are a detriment to soil health. There's no doubt about it. Where in nature do you find a monoculture? It's pretty rare. Pretty rare. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's pretty rare, right? Usually man has mismanaged something to the point it's now a monoculture, right? It's the diversity that drives soil health. You get a healthy, diverse plant population, you're going to have much healthier soil. So here's what we're doing on our operation. This is just some of the cash crops we grow. Remember how I said my father-in-law only planted spring wheat, oats, barley? Those are all cool season grasses. Now I plant hairy vetch and peas. Those are cool season broadleaves. I also plant corn and millet, warm season grasses, sunflowers, warm season broadleaf. Now we're not planting all these together, okay? But our crop rotation is set up so a particular field in a 5-year span is going to have at least one of those cash crops on it to get diversity in there. Now I'm in a cool season environment, so I'm going to have more cool season species than warm season. Down here, you're going to want more warm seasons than cool seasons because that's your environment. But the fact of the matter is we need diversity. You know, it's not uncommon for me to do workshops in the Corn Belt where you can drive for 500 miles and only see corn and beans. I mean, that's common. That's all they plant. It's corn and beans. What are they doing to their soil? How is soil biology going to be fed a diverse diet if all you feed it is 2 root exudates? You know? This is simple. We need to diversify the rotation. Now, what we've gone to in our operation is rarely will I plant a monoculture. So, this is oats with 3 types of clover growing in it. This is corn with hairy vetch growing in it. This is a diverse mix of cool season broadleaves. We graze that mix. This here is my sunflowers, and there's actually 19 different species of covers growing underneath that sunflower crop. So I'm trying to never grow a monoculture because I know how nature functions. So with all those species, I'm getting the synergy of legumes, cycling nitrogen. I'm getting all the diversity to feed biology a very diverse diet. I'm improving root structure, increasing organic matter, collecting maximum sunlight to cycle carbon. This is, in our environment, cool season. Fall seeded biennials work extremely well. This is triticale and hairy vetch. It's just a no-brainer for me. We plant several hundred acres every year because it's going to work. It just will not fail me. This is the oats with the clovers growing underneath it. See, we're able to straight combine off the oats. We got all the clovers growing. Then we can turn our livestock out on the clovers. We grow cash crops on 80 to 90% of our cropland acres every year. However, along with the cash crop, there's going to be a cover crop growing either before it, along with it, or after it. Now, the other 10 to 20% of our cropland acres, we do what we call full season covers. That's what Rocco was asking about. If you can grow a full season cover, then convert it to a cash crop. There's a young man by the name of Gary Richardson in Manitoba who first came to my place in 2003. He's gone to a system now where he seeds 2 full years of cover crops, grazing them with livestock, then 1 year of cash crops, very profitable cash crops. But those 2 years of cover fuel his year of cash crop. But he's making enough money grazing the covers that he's replaced the cash crops with cover crops. You can do that. Okay, 4th tenet of soil health, living root in the ground as long as possible. I showed you this picture earlier of this native prairie of ours. My son, for 5 years, he taught rangeland management at the local community college. He brought his students out to this pasture, and in 2 hours' time, they counted over 140 different species of grasses, forbs, and legumes. That's tremendous diversity. Yet, here I know of a lot of farmers who only grow 1 or 2 different crops. And we wonder why the soil's unhealthy. Now, I'm not saying you have to grow 140, but in our native pastures, in any of our pasture land, we should certainly have a lot more than just a few. You know, I've seen a lot of monoculture fescue pastures in the southeast, you know. Shouldn't happen. The thing that native prairie has going for it, as I said earlier, from the time our snow melts in the spring until it is so deep in the fall that nothing will grow, there's something growing all the time. So never pass up the opportunity to have something growing and cycle carbon. This was a rye field we combined. This photo was taken in October, this past fall. We had probably froze 15, 20 times by then. But due to the health of the soil, I still have a living cover. Because immediately after that rye crop was combined, I was in there seeding that cover crop. That's oats, peas, lentils, and radish growing in there. Now behind it up there, that's a cover crop of sorghum sudan grass. Look how green it is, and it froze many, many times. But the thing is, when you have healthy soil, you're able to extend your growing season. Our last frost in the spring is usually around mid-May. First one in the fall is give or take a couple days from September 10th usually. So that 120 days, I used to think that was my growing season. Now I can easily have things growing as long as we don't have snow up until Thanksgiving. Now this year we had several feet of snow by Thanksgiving, so it shut down earlier. But I've extended my growing season due to the health of our soils. Think of it this way, when we all came in here this morning, it was pretty cool in this room. The longer we sit here, temperature rises, right? That's the same way it is in the soil. You get a healthy soil full of biology, you're going to be able to extend your growing season later in the year because the soil health has increased. It all begins with photosynthesis. The more photosynthesis, the more carbon you're going to have cycling in your system. Take a look at that picture. Which field's going to capture more solar energy? That's a pretty easy question, isn't it? You know? But that's what it's about. You have to be able to collect sunlight. Over here, that soil temp is just increasing. You're not capturing solar energy. It's like I said, field across the road here, no solar energy is being cycled. Down the road just a piece, you had that lush growing cover crop. It's easy to see which one's going to put more dollars in their pocket. Now, talk about cover crops. That's a way to extend the growing season. These are just, that's really out of focus, it's so small, but that's okay. These are just some of the cover crops we use on our operation. All I'm trying to point out here is notice the diversity. Now, we're not growing all these at once. We're going to grow cover crops according to what's the resource concern on that particular garden, cropland field, whatever the case may be. What is it you're trying to do? I get calls every year, these cover crops just don't work. No, cover crops do what they're intended to do. Maybe we just planted the wrong ones. You know, what is it you're trying to do? Do you want to improve infiltration? Do you want to add soil armor? You know, what is it? Do you want to feed livestock? Do you want to improve wildlife? Do you need to build your organic matter? Do you need to cycle more nutrients? What is it you're trying to do? Once you figure that out, then you can design and decide which cover crop species you want to plant. So for a gardener, what would you want to do? Maybe you want to cycle more nitrogen. Well, then you should be planting maybe some peas in the fall of the year to cycle nitrogen. You know, maybe you need armor. Maybe you got some bare soil. Well, then you better plant a higher carbon crop cover that's going to give you more armor. We can design our mixes all around this. This is just one of the cover crop combinations that I seeded. Now, I was out in California, they were eating things like that, and I'm like, oh, I usually seed it, but that particular mix had 19 different species in it, okay? But every one of these species had a specific reason for being in there. Yes?
Okay, the difference in sizes of the seeds in your drilling.
Yep. I think I have that photo maybe in this presentation. The question was the different size seed, how do you get it to seed right? Okay, I just set it so I'm covering the seed, seeding 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch deep. That large seed will break the way. You know, these beans and soybeans and these cowpeas and that, those cotyledons will break the way for that smaller seed, and then the clover, radish, millet, whatever will just come up with it. Now, I often get asked, well, does it settle out in the drill? We're only seeding 1/4 at a time, maybe 160 acres. I doubt there's many people down here seeding that much. It's not going to settle out by that time, by the time you're done. Even if it does settle a little, it's cover crop. Who cares? Who cares if it's not perfect, When seeds disperse naturally in the wind or by wildlife, it's not a perfect stand, right? So you don't pay any attention to it. Just get it in the ground rather than in the bag and it'll grow, usually, Okay, think of what I'm doing here with this much diversity though. I'm accelerating biological time. If I was to seed every one of those cover crop species as a monoculture, it'd take me 19 years to do what I'm going to do in 1 year, right? I'm speeding things up. That's how nature functions. Think of it if you're a microorganism in the soil and I only seed flax. You're only going to get fed those root exudates from that flax plant. Now you go in there and seed all these things, all of a sudden that biology is going, wow, I'm at a buffet, Then the biology gets looking like me. That's how it works, okay? It's all about creating a healthy soil ecosystem. To do that, you need diversity. Now, every one of these species, as I said, serves a different purpose. Sunflower has a very deep taproot, really likes heat in the summer. So we put that in for that reason. Also, when it flowers, it attracts a lot of pollinator insects. Sorghum sudan grass, fibrous root system. So you're going to build more soil aggregates with it. German millet, another fibrous root system. Soybeans, cowpeas, legumes to fix nitrogen. The kale really has a broad, wide leaf, collect more sunlight. Radish, very deep taproot, break up hardpan areas. And down on the line you go. Every one of these species has different abilities. And there are many good books out there. One of them is put out by SARE, S-A-R-E. It's free, available online. Farming Cover Crops Profitably. You can learn about these different species and what each one does. If you're going to deal with a seed source, to source your cover crop seed, you call them up or go to their office. The first thing they should ask you is your name and your location. After that, they better be asking you what's your resource concern. If they're not, don't do business with them because they're just going to try and sell you something. Okay? Make sure your seed supplier knows what each of these species does, the advantages and disadvantages of both, because I've seen a lot of wrecks with cover crops too. Wasn't the cover crop that caused it, it was just that the wrong species was used to address the resource concern of that particular individual. Now, one of the benefits of planting diverse mixes is, look at all the different leaf sizes and shapes I have there. No matter what angle that sun's at, I'm going to be able to take in the most sunlight, photosynthesize, thus putting the more carbon into my soil and improving the soil. So for our gardens, we love a diverse cover crop mix on there, the year prior, because it's really collecting a lot of sunlight. We've got a lot of carbon stored. That'll feed the next year's vegetable production. So this was a particular cover crop I seeded in August. There we are by mid-September. Now I guarantee you that's had less than an inch of rain on it since seeding, because our rain usually shuts off in early July and we don't get rain again until late September, usually. That's not uncommon for us at all. But look at the diversity out there. What I'm really trying to do is feed everything, both the above ground biology, in this case wildlife, also the insects. And so many people look at insects as a pest. We need to change our mindset as far as that's concerned. This is Phacelia, and there's a native pollinator bee on there. I had a group from the Xerces Society out to my place last summer, and they were just going nuts because they've never seen as many species of native pollinators. But the reason is we try and have pollinating flowers to attract the pollinators blooming at all times throughout the growing season on our operation. It's a proven fact that if you have a beehive located within a quarter of a mile of any of your crops that need pollinating, you're going to get about a 10% increase in pollination rates. Why wouldn't you want that? Why wouldn't you want to attract them? The other thing is, a lot of these insects are predators, like lady beetles. They're ferocious predators. Why do I want to go apply some chemical, especially on food we're going to eat, but I don't want to apply it anyway, when I can have predator insects that'll take care of them for me? Jonathan Lundgren, who's a really good entomologist, told me this. For every insect species that's a pest, there are 1,700 that are beneficial. So here farmers are out there trying to kill that pest. Why not just try and provide a home for a few of the 1,700? They're going to take care of that pest, right? You know, it just amazes me how backwards we've gone in production agriculture. They set up a camera in a cornfield in Iowa, and they took a picture over 24 hours of video of all the activity on that square area in 24 hours. What do you got? Grasshoppers, mosquitoes, and more grasshoppers, mostly pests, right? Then they set it up over native prairie. Look at that. That's life. And when you take into account that the majority of these are beneficial, I would take this over that any day. Any day. Now, in saying that, I'll tell you some exciting research that's going to be released here. It has just gone to be peer-reviewed. But Dr. Lundgren did a 2-year study with some of his grad students where they went to regenerative producers such as mine, and our operation was one of them, and they tested, we're growing corn without any stack traits, so no corn rootworm, no corn BT, none of that. But we're using covers with a lot of diversity. Then they went to producers near us who were using those stack trait genetics for pest control. They replicated this in 5 states throughout the Midwest: North Dakota, Minnesota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas, I believe. And they did this multiple years. At the end, what they found was every single cornfield that they went into and tested for corn borer and corn rootworm that used stack traits had those insects in those fields. They found 0. Over 2 years, they did not find a single corn borer or corn rootworm in any of the fields where the regenerative practices with covers were used. Meanwhile, how many producers are spending tens of thousands of dollars per year on those traits? It's absolutely amazing. Build it and they'll come. The reason producers have pest problems is because of lack of diversity. There's no home for the predators. And then also they've sprayed insecticides to kill them off. Now, one of the things we've moved into on our operation, we're starting in some fruit production. So we have orchards of fruit trees, and then here we've planted nut trees. But what we're doing underneath that is we're seeding perennial mixes to attract those insects. So this is chicory in bloom. See the sheep in there grazing. But we're not only planting species for long-term production, the perennial fruit and nut trees, but we're using this to attract all our pollinator and predator insects, plus we're grazing it with sheep to convert it to dollars early on. All producers have some little odd area, corner of a field or a field out of place, something like that, where they could be planting perennials in order to attract those beneficial insects. Yes?
Dr. John Andre out of Clemson has done some work with the chicory and lambs and has proven that it has a really great effect on worming the lambs.
Chicory has a great effect on deworming? On worming the lambs? That's great to know. I did not know that. I knew plantain did that, but I did not know chicory. See, chicory, the reason we plant it is tremendously deep taproot, and it's long-lived in drier conditions. And for that flowering, you know, it'll be flowering all throughout the year. So that's good to know. Thanks for sharing that. And then we're planting warm season, you know, species in there, and very diverse native species also, as habitat for them, and to attract the beneficials like the bees, etc. Yes?
Unrelated question. When you grow corn and sunflowers, things with the tough, thick stalks, and then you push it over, do you need to chop it up? Or?
Do we need to chop any of the sunflower stalks or corn stalks? No, not at all. No, especially if you're using the non-BT, non-genetically modified varieties, they'll break down much easier. So it's a non-issue for us. We never chop it up. We want the residue laying there because that's armor. We want it to cycle through more slowly. It's a good question. So just quickly, another thing, I'll show you an example of natural predator control, what we do with our livestock. So we don't use any vaccines, dewormers, porons, anything on our livestock. This is showing there's a bunch of tree swallows that are flying around the livestock. In a few areas, we have a few trees, we'll get some of those swallows. More than that, though, we have what's called cowbirds, and they will follow the cattle herds around if you have the habitat for them to nest. And we can get great numbers of these following our cow herd around. And it's to the point that they'll even overwinter at our place now. You know, I don't know how well they did this winter. We were 40 to 60 below wind chills many nights, and this is typical of the country of RC. The only place we have trees is around the farmstead. I have a pasture with a tree in it. That's about it. So, but one of the things we noticed, we quit using all those anthelmintics and insecticides on livestock back in '07. We had 0 dung beetle species. We couldn't find a single one for the first 2 years. Now we've actually got 16 species. This is an old slide that we've documented now on our place. And we didn't introduce them at all. They just come. They'll find you. They'll migrate and find the herds where that are not using those. And we have a lot of other predator insects. This is yellow dung flies. They'll feed on the fly larvae. Works great. And then we have things, hister beetles, rove beetles. There's many different types of insects that are predators. Dragonflies, I mean, they're just deadly, 90+% kill rate on flies. I don't know what grad student found that out, but that's a meaningless fact, okay? The other thing is we use rotation a lot. We move our livestock daily through the growing season, and that really helps for control of pests also. Velvet mites, blister beetles, there's many, many of them. Orb weavers, how would you like to be a fly trying to get through that pasture, you know? Now, I tell people my 30-year-old son is single. Here's one of the reasons why. He actually charts the populations of those different insects. He spends a lot of time looking through manure, and I told him, if I ever want grandkids, you got to quit doing that, you know? But he's charted. His whole point here is realize, this is months of the year, realize, you know, come February, we're actually starting to see some dung beetles show up even that early in a healthy environment. But notice during the natural life cycle, when this particular yellow dung fly is down in population, there's other ones that are up. And he's got this all figured out. I don't know. He'd have to explain this to you. But the important thing I'm trying to get across here is in a healthy ecosystem, this is how nature functions. Nature takes care of those things. And Paul, my son's actually figured out how many dollars he's going to save in his lifetime by not buying all those inputs. And it's just staggering. He'll be able to retire really wealthy. So we have not used a pesticide since before the turn of the century, with the exception of seed treatment on corn, and simply because I wasn't able to find non-treated corn seed up until 2010. Then I simply started buying organic seed, and now we're actually growing open pollinated corn that we're saving our own seed. Okay? No need to, since predator insects take care of the pests for us. If you build it, they will come, plain and simple. Here's another interesting fact. This work was done also by Dr. Jonathan Lundgren. He found that in an average grain field in South Dakota, there was 162,000 weed seeds per square meter. If you have a healthy population of insects, they'll eat 10% of the weed seeds per day. Per day. Think of what that. I often get asked the question, Gabe, don't all these cover crops that you're letting go to seed become weeds? I just don't see it, and this is the reason why. That healthy population of insects in the soil is taking care of it for us. Okay. I'm going to show you a few ways quickly to use covers to address resource concerns. So I showed you the neighbor's field with the poor infiltration. Here was a photo back about 3-4 years ago. My son said, Dad, for Father's Day, they're having a soil health tour. Yeah, I'd love to go on it. This is the photo we took. The guy was showing us his field. He was so proud of it. He says, yeah, I got a little problem usually every spring because we till heavily. And I'm like, oh boy, we got a long way to go. So one of the ways to improve it is just what I do is keep armor on the soil. The other thing, though, to realize is there's diversity below ground, too. One of the most interesting things is find a soil district or someone who's doing a cover crop tour and have them dig a soils pit right next to it. And then look at the different rooting types and depths. It's absolutely amazing the power of those roots and what they'll do. Here's a picture of a daikon radish. And you see that's about a foot above ground there. I guarantee you if you dig down in the soil here, you're going to find a hardpan layer down underneath this soil. What usually happens with those daikons is they'll start growing down, they'll hit a hardpan layer, then they'll push up above ground till they get enough energy to poke through. So if you're seeing a lot of that in your fields, that's not necessarily a good thing. You got a hardpan layer down below there somewhere. Now, one thing about the daikons, they're day length sensitive. So you don't want to plant them till after the longest day of the year. If you plant them before then, they're just going to bolt and go to seed, and you won't get that big tuber if you want it for infiltration. Yes?
Talk about the hardpan. What do you think of that deep subsoiling?
What do I think of deep subsoiling? Right there is what I use to subsoil. All you're going to do with deep subsoiling is move that hardpan layer right below the depth you subsoil at. So will it improve it above there? Yes, temporarily, but now you've got a hardpan layer a little deeper. I'd really rather have roots that'll go down 15 feet. And we have found annual roots down 12, 15 feet in the year of seeding. Can be done, yes.
You showed that I have that with the daikon radishes poking up out of the soil. Just keep persistent, just keep planting them, and, and they'll...
Those, anything with deep taproots, sunflowers would work. Now, they're going to naturally come up some, but usually not to this extreme. If it's this extreme, you know you got a hardpan. But they will be some above ground. And these daikons can get really big. That's a 16-inch tire there. You know, that's huge. My friend David Brandt in Ohio, he always brags about his large daikons. David has been no-till since 72, cover crop since 79, 225 bushel corn, no fertilizer, no tile drainage. He's doing it all with soil health. So David brags about his big radish, and I brag about my big turnips. Now here's how David does it. David's got a white planter, and realize I'm showing this on large scale, but think of in your garden, you can do this too in a garden areas, no matter the size of the operation. What David's doing is after a wheat crop, he goes in there and he plants peas in one row, radish in the next. Now think of what he's trying to do there. You got the peas are fixing nitrogen, right? Radishes are our nitrogen accumulator. This is just a little later in the growing season. Here's the radishes a little later on poking down into that soil. And isn't that amazing? You can almost see right there, there's a little hardpan layer. Look at that growing up. But that's why he's growing these radish to poke through that hardpan. The legumes, those are nodules. He's fixing nitrogen. Now I better say that in case you don't know. Each legume takes a specific inoculant. You got to inoculate this seed with the proper rhizobia so it'll fix nitrogen. Just be aware of that. So what he's doing, the legumes fixing nitrogen, that radish is storing that nitrogen. Spring of the year then, you see all the radish carcasses here? That radish then is releasing that nitrogen back out for the next year's corn crop. So he plants his corn right next to those radish rows. Those radishes are supplying nitrogen to that corn. So the radishes not only helped alleviate the hardpan, but it stored the nutrients, and that's what cover crops do. It'll store the nutrients on your land. You know, one of the things I find I really like about Carolinas here and that, you've got running water everywhere, you know, but with the slope you have in that, it's going to take the nutrients with it. Why don't you want to store it on your land? Okay? That's what's happening here. We're fixing the nitrogen, we're storing it, then it's breaking down, to feed the next year's crop. That's what you want to do. There's a really good example. Look at all those radish holes there. Think of how that improved infiltration too. Plant the corn right alongside it. That corn root's just going to follow that radish root right down, you know, where the radish root was, taking in all that nitrogen. Yes.
Are those peas combined off the field?
Are those peas combined? David's case, they were a cover crop planted in the fall, so they winter killed, as did the radish. Yep, they were not combined. I talked about improving organic matter and what that does. For every 1% organic matter, you'll hold about 20,000 gallons of water. Now, I talked about how when I started, my fields were 1.7 to 1.9% organic matter. I have silt loam soil, so I could store about 2 inches of water for every foot of the soil profile. So if my soil's 4 feet deep, I could hold about 8 inches of water. Now, today, our organic matter levels are much, much higher than that. We can now hold well over 20 inches of water in our soil profile. So it doesn't matter how much rain falls, I'm going to be able to infiltrate it and then hold it. That's why I don't worry at all about drought. You know, Laura's book, Resilient Agriculture, that's what it's about. How do you become resilient to these fluctuations in moisture, temperature, etc.? That's what you do with a healthy ecosystem. You build resiliency. So our organic matter levels now, this last year when we tested a year ago, we were 6.3 to 6.9 on our cropland fields. And when we started, we were 1.7 to 1.9. Now, I'm not going to say all the fields are like that, and it's going to vary and fluctuate according to the cash crop, according to the covers, but you can really build this much faster than one used to think possible. There's about 20,000 pounds in what's called a furrow slice, 6 inches of soil. 1% organic matter is about 20,000 pounds. So if we figure out the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, we have about $731 worth of nutrients for every 1% organic matter in the soil. 5% organic matter soil, you'd have about $3,600 worth of nutrients in it. Why don't we focus on these things, on building our soils, and it'll supply the nutrients we need. And that's all nutrients then that can grow a healthy crop and then be really nutrient-dense food for consumption. We can use covers as weed control. This was a cover crop seeded the fall before. I grazed it with livestock. This is the following spring. Now, you can kind of see on the fields next to it with no cover. See how green they are? You had to look here. No green. How many weeds are going to emerge through that residue? Not very many. I can no-till my corn into there, and I can make it till July before we start seeing many weeds show up. Here's a really good picture. This is of a producer back home who he planted peas in both these fields the year before, grew a cover crop following the peas. He combined off the peas. On this side of the tree row, no cover crop here. This is the next spring. Now, he was able to graze his livestock on that cover crop, thus converting some to dollars. But look at the weed control. He had 2 more chemical passes over here. You can use weeds for that. Use cover crops, for that. So one of the issues a lot of crop producers ask me is, all right, what if with all that residue your soils are so cold? This is a producer about 20 miles north of me. We went up to his place. You could see what he planted the previous 5 years. It was corn and spring wheat, winter wheat, sunflowers, and barley. You know, he had a tremendous amount of residue. He doesn't have a residue problem. He had a carbon-nitrogen ratio problem. He planted all species that were high in carbon, low in nitrogen. The residue just kept building up. He didn't have the biology to cycle it through. How do we fix that? We go in there and plant radish and peas, just like David did. Now he added peas to his crop rotation. Radish accumulates the nitrogen, breaks down the residue, no problem anymore. Simply a matter of learning carbon-nitrogen ratios. Most soils are about 11 to 1 carbon to nitrogen, you know. Well, this producer was planting all high carbon crops that were 80 to 1, 90 to 1. You know, they're going to take a long time to break down. Fifth tenet of soil health is animal impact, integrating livestock into the operation. When Europeans came over to this land, there was a tremendous amount of wildlife. You know, in the northern plains, there was bison and elk, and they were being pushed along by the wolves. But you also had your local populations of rabbits and even grasshoppers, and you had just a tremendous amount of diversity out on the land. I can drive for hundreds of miles through the Midwest and not see a fence nowadays till I get to a feedlot. Doesn't that look appetizing? It's an aerial view of a feedlot in central U.S. I'm a firm believer that when livestock are in a lot, you cannot address resource concerns, you can only make them. And I think that's one of the real travesties to the environment that we're doing now, is we're confining all of our animals. And it really makes for tough situations. You know, I fly from here on Monday up to Pennsylvania, and the issues they're having there, due to the large amount of dairies and that, they're getting too much phosphorus built up. And you know, with the Chesapeake, that's become a real issue. And you look at what we're doing in agriculture, what we're contributing to some of these water problems, it is really scary. So this is our ranch, and this is part of it. It's not all of it. But the light blue areas are cropland areas. The light green areas, that's what I call my tame grass pasture. In other words, it was cropped at one time, and now it was seeded back to perennials. Then everything outlined in yellow is all native pasture. So how do we integrate these so we can get livestock out on all the parcels, all the landscape? And one of the ways we do that is with covers. And we will plant covers according to when we have a gap in our forage production. You know, when is our native pastures not at their peak for forage? When do we need the energy? So in this particular case, this is a diverse mix that we're gonna graze with our grass finishers. Diversity helps prevent off flavors. So many times people say, oh, I don't like the taste of grass finished beef. Well, what was it finished on? If you have a diverse mix, you can certainly alleviate some of those off flavors. We'll put plantain in the mix because it's a natural anthelmintic. It'll take care of some internal parasites, as will chicory, evidently. Then what we'll do, we'll allow the animals, when we're grass finishing, to select for energy. We're not going to make them eat everything, those that we're grass finishing on. We can get really good gains on this. This past year, we averaged 4.05 pounds a day gain on our finishers, and those finishers were weighing from 1,000 to 1,350 pounds, and we're still getting that kind of gains on there. Year in and year out on our covers, we'll easily average 2¼ pounds a day gain or more on these. Here's, this was just taken this last fall. This was a brown midrib, sorghum, sudan, cowpea, mung bean, kale mix with some clover. And see, we're letting them just strip the leaves and they're leaving the rest. That's the armor, that's the carbon to cover the soil, but they're putting on tremendous weight gain while doing that. After they move through and it'll dry up, die down, look at that armor on the soil. Then next year, I can no-till my cash crop in there. I don't have to worry about weed control. It's taken care of. I don't have to worry about it getting too hot. There's no bare soil. Plus, it's feeding all those worms and biology. The other thing we'll do on our operation, you had a question, Rocco?
Yeah, but when you planted into that warm mix, where you were planting into pasture?
No, I never plant into pasture on my place. This was in cropland. That was a barley pea field that we had grazed off previous. And then in July, you know, we grazed it in early July and come right behind with this warm season mix. Yep, in that particular field's case. Now, some of our covers then, if we're not going to grass finish on them, we'll seed a little different mix, and that's where we winter our cow herd. We calve in late May and June, and then we leave the calves on the cows all winter, and they're out grazing covers. Now, this winter, it's been extremely difficult. We had to move to some what we call bale grazing, where we got the bales set out on those tame grass pastures, and the cattle have access to them, because we had 5 feet of snow. You could drive a tractor over. It was blowing so hard. Well, our cattle do a lot for us, but that was asking a little too much. So here we'll be able to push posts in the ground even in the winter, and then rotate the cattle through there, through those covers. This just shows we're moving them about twice a week during the winter. At least that's what my son tells me. I'm not home, so I really don't know how often he moves them, but he tells me he gets them moved. Now, North Dakota State University did some really good research as far as the nutrient quality of these forages in the winter after they've froze off, and we're able to plant species that'll hold its nutrients longer into the winter. For instance, hairy vetch in December will still be 18% crude protein, 70% TDN. That'll balance the protein needs of any livestock during the winter months, about any livestock anyway.
Gabe, what are the genetics in your beef?
Yeah, the genetics in the beef herd. I sold bulls for 26 years. We were balancer bulls, Gelbvieh Angus, Gelbvieh Red Angus. I should have probably dispersed those. The Gelbvieh are just too big to grass finish in our environment, but they made really good windbreak for the smaller cows, so we kept them. They were, however, acclimated to our environment, so we did not just sell those off and go buy some. We let our cattle select for themselves. So we never keep an open cow, but here's our whole culling process. As long as that cow brings us a live calf every year and her disposition's okay in that, they can live as long as they want at our place. You know, now, I'll be very honest, back here 3 years ago when cattle hit $3,000 plus, we went out and everything over the age of 15 we sold. And we had 80 some head that were that old. So that'll tell you how long they can live in our environment. Now what we do for the heifers, and I'll just briefly explain that, we fence line wean these calves. Matter of fact, next week when I get home, we plan on weaning. And then they'll go right out on some stockpiled forage that we left from the year before, unless we have too much snow. But then come August, we'll take and split the steers from the heifers. All the heifers will get exposed to the bull for 30 days. At the end of that, come December, we'll ultrasound those heifers. Whatever's bred goes into the cow herd. Whatever's open goes to grass finishing. Now, we do have to sell some bred heifers because we don't get a whole lot of open cows. The cows never get PG'd because what are we going to do when we PG them? I'm not going to have a couple calves standing around. So all we do is once we wean the calves, the cows go back out on grass, stockpiled forage. They'll calve in May and June. The end of June, we go out there one day, bring them all into a corral. Any cow that doesn't have a calf on her goes to make burger. That's our whole culling process.
To clarify, you are practicing non-selective grazing except on the finishing herd, right?
What do you define what you
like
mean?
High stocking densities, pretty much forcing them to eat and or trample everything there.
No, on the grass finishers are not high.
I understand that,
Yeah.
but what about everybody else or overwintering?
Yeah, overwintering certainly not because it's a labor thing. I'll show you this afternoon all my son has to do while I'm gone. He keeps pretty busy. Might be part of the reason he's still single, we'll see. But there's no reason to move them more often than that. During the growing season, the cow herd gets moved once a day. The yearlings and finishers, I'm in charge of those groups. They can be moved anywhere from once to 6 times a day, depending on what we're trying to do for the resource. If we want to lay down armor, we'll be up at times over 1 million pounds of beef per acre, high stock density. Normally, we like that sweet range of anywhere from 250 to 500,000 pounds of animal live weight per acre, which I don't consider ultra high stock density. A lot of people think it is, but we don't. You know, that's just how we run things. Okay? The other thing is you got to allow your livestock to do what they do best. Don't give them a bed and breakfast. It amazes me. Last winter, I spent 2 weeks in Texas. There's guys down there in Texas feeding hay 5 times longer than I feed it. In North Dakota.
It was kind of related to that as far as stockpiling and how the nutrients stay or not stay in the grass. I don't know much about it, but I've heard something here where it can be still very biologically active and raining, but maybe the grass isn't really growing that much. Can leaching be a problem?
Oh yeah, certainly. Can nutrients be leached? Oh, certainly it can be.
Because that's trying to get it frozen. And
Yep. See, there's a lot of beauties about living in my environment. One, we don't have millions of people crammed into a small area. But one of the beauties is, I mean, it freezes where everything's frozen solid and your nutrients, everything are going to be there. That's why in this environment, what the role I see for cover crops is to have something growing during that time of the year when your native or perennial species are not at their nutritional peak. See? Yeah, exactly. But my point being, why be out there feeding them hay and that when they could be out grazing? Now, obviously, in real wet environments, you got a challenge with some plugging of soils and things you're going to have to address. You know, I know that. So, any questions? I'm right up to break time. Isn't that about perfect time? Any other questions?